and care. And I think it's a bit of a truism that sometimes it's assumed by professionals who are involved with the care of somebody with increasing needs and a declining capacity. It's sometimes assumed that they know best what would be best for that person, and the reflection on the question of whether that person still has capacity to decide for themselves can sometimes be slightly rushed or overlooked, and this case illustrates that. And I'm not going to read through word for word the passage in the judgment, but it's a very useful starting point, a set of reminders of what goes to make up the capacity test, and that starting with the statutory test, the burden of proof being on the person who says that P doesn't have capacity. And then what does the Act say about what does it mean, lack of a capacity? And that's what you'll find in sections 2 and 3 of the Mental Capacity Act. Section 2, sometimes called the diagnostic test, is that somebody's unable to make decisions because of an impairment of a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. And it's important to remember when you're considering, does somebody I'm professionally concerned with have capacity or not, who is to assess capacity, how good is the assessment, it's not necessary for the assessment to clinically say precisely what is the impairment or disturbance. It doesn't have to be a clinical assessment, provided that you can satisfy the court that there is an impairment or disturbance of functioning. You're not just dealing with somebody who's rather ill-educated and superficial in their decision making. There has to be something clinical going on. That's the diagnostic test. Then the second stage, sometimes known as the functional test, is whether the impairment or disturbance makes the person unable to make the decision. And section 3 defines what is inability to make a decision. It's got 4 elements: inability to understand information relevant to the decision, inability to retain that information, inability to use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision, and inability to communicate the decision, whether by talking or any other means. And in most cases, it's A, B, and C, understanding, retaining, and using, that are going to be the key elements in the assessment that you're looking at. The judge then reminds everyone that assessments are issue specific and time specific, and I'll say a bit more about time specific in a moment, that somebody's not to be treated as lacking capacity unless all practical steps to help them make a capacitous decision have been taken. And that means really giving somebody relevant information about the decision before you decide whether or not they can retain and use it. And again, the next point the judge makes is one that's very important in a practical context in any given case of trying to decide whether somebody has capacity or not. What is it that they actually have to understand? Not necessarily every detail of the issue, not necessarily all peripheral detail, but the salient details relevant to the decision to be made. And obviously there's a bit of a judgment call for whoever is doing the assessment as to what is salient and what is peripheral. Not everybody's always going to agree about that. And then finally, a person not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because they make an unwise decision. That's in the Act, and the SB case I just mentioned is a pretty graphic illustration of that, where the judge says that he didn't think all the reasons were very sensible, but they were all rational. And in assessing the question of capacity, the court must consider all relevant evidence. What that means is clinical evidence isn't necessarily determinative, and we'll look at some of the cases that really illustrate that. Ultimately, it's a matter for the court. And the final point that Mr. Justice Baker made in the